bleak winter of 1936, in a small Ukrainian village called Yablochin, a child was born who would one day become one of the most infamous serial killers in history. His name was Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. To understand how a quiet, sickly boy would later transform into the Butcher of Rostov, we must first look closely at the world he was born into. An unforgiving landscape shaped by famine, war, and terror. Andrei's early years unfolded in the shadow of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, a regime that demanded loyalty but offered little compassion. His parents were impoverished peasants, struggling to survive in the aftermath of the Holodomor, the man-made famine of the early 1930s that had devastated Ukraine. Stories of starvation and cannibalism circulated through villages, whispered in hushed tones by survivors. For Andrei, these weren't just distant rumors. His mother told him that before his birth, his older brother Stepan had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors. Whether that story was true or not has never been proven, but it left a haunting impression on the young boy. From the very start of his life, the association between survival, hunger, and violence was carved into his mind. His father, Roman, was drafted into the Red Army during World War II and later captured by the Germans. In Soviet society, being taken prisoner was considered a mark of shame, and when Roman eventually returned, he carried not only physical scars, but also the stigma of being labeled a traitor. While his father was away, Andrei's mother, Anna, struggled to raise him and his sister under brutal conditions. Their home was a one-room hut infested with lice, with little food to eat. Andrei grew up malnourished, shy, and painfully weak. He suffered from frequent bedwetting, poor eyesight, and other health issues that made him an outcast among his peers. Other children mocked him, and he withdrew further into his own lonely world. School offered no refuge. Though he was bright and had a strong memory, his shyness and physical frailty made him a target for bullying. Teachers were harsh, often resorting to beatings as discipline. Andrei was humiliated time and again, developing a deep resentment toward authority figures and classmates alike. At the same time, he excelled in subjects like literature and was fascinated by reading. He dreamed of escaping poverty by becoming a teacher, a respected profession in Soviet society. Yet, even as he buried himself in books, darker thoughts began to form. One of the most critical aspects of Andrei's early development was his struggle with impotence. As he entered adolescence, he discovered he could not perform sexually like other boys. His body betrayed him, and he felt powerless, inadequate, and ashamed. At a time when masculinity in the Soviet Union was tied to strength, productivity, and virility, Andrei felt like a failure. His sexual frustration grew into obsession. In one disturbing incident during his teenage years, he accidentally discovered arousal while wrestling with his sister's friend. The act was non-consensual and violent, yet it triggered a realization. Domination and aggression could give him a sense of power that normal intimacy never could. This seed of sexual violence, planted in adolescence, would later bloom into something far more sinister. Meanwhile, the world around him was filled with violence. World War II left Ukraine devastated, villages destroyed, and families broken. Soldiers returning from the front carried horror stories of death and cruelty. Children like Andrei grew up seeing corpses in fields, hearing about executions, and living with constant fear. Survival required toughness, but Andrei was physically weak, often mocked as unmanly. He developed an inner world where fantasies of power and control replaced the humiliation he felt in daily life. By the early 1950s, Andrei was a young man searching for identity in a society that gave him little comfort. He joined the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, and outwardly tried to present himself as a model Soviet citizen. But his private life was tormented. His impotence remained unresolved, and his social awkwardness kept him isolated. Instead of friendships and relationships, he collected resentment, humiliation, and dark fantasies. One memory he would later recount was of lying awake at night, listening to his mother tell him about the famine years, neighbors resorting to eating the dead, parents losing children to hunger. These chilling tales mixed with his own hunger, his sexual frustrations, and his feelings of weakness. In this environment, violence and survival were not abstract ideas, they were daily realities. And for Andrei, they began to intertwine with desire. His teenage years ended without romance, without belonging, and without hope for normality. Though he would soon go on to higher education and eventually the army, the foundations of the man he would become were already solidifying. He had learned that the world was cruel, that weakness invited ridicule, and that domination, even violent domination, brought him fleeting feelings of strength. This toxic mixture of trauma, humiliation, and perverse discovery marked the beginning of a path that would later horrify the world. By the time Andrei Chikatilo left his teenage years behind in the early 1950s, the boy who had been born into famine and fear was no longer just a victim of circumstance. Inside him, something far darker was taking shape. His hunger was no longer just for food or for acceptance. It was for power, control, and an outlet for desires he could not fulfill in normal life. The stage was set for the next chapter of his journey, one that would lead him deeper into obsession, secrecy, and violence. In 1953, when Joseph Stalin died, the Soviet Union entered a period of cautious change. But for young Andrei Chikatilo, life remained a battle with his own weaknesses and insecurities. He had survived a brutal childhood in famine, ravaged Ukraine, endured constant bullying, and carried the heavy burden of sexual dysfunction. Yet outwardly, he was trying to carve out a future for himself. Education was his escape, and he believed that if he worked hard enough, he might overcome the poverty and humiliation that had defined his youth. Chikatilo enrolled in a technical school where he studied communications and engineering. It was here that his intelligence became more visible. He was diligent, committed to his studies, and determined to succeed. Teachers noticed his seriousness, and unlike in childhood, he finally found a space where his bookishness was valued. But his social awkwardness remained. While other young men his age were discovering relationships, dating, and intimacy, Andrei remained isolated. His impotence haunted him. He could not bring himself to approach women, fearing rejection and humiliation. Instead, he retreated further into books and fantasies. Despite his shyness, he longed for connection. Letters from classmates describe him as quiet, nervous, and somewhat strange. He avoided social gatherings, preferring long walks alone or late nights buried in reading. But beneath the surface, his frustrations were intensifying. His inability to express himself sexually left him feeling powerless, and this powerlessness fueled private fantasies where control was absolute and victims were silent. At this stage, those fantasies remained locked in his mind, but the seeds of his future crimes were already germinating. By 1957, after completing his schooling, Andrei was drafted into the Soviet Army. Military service was mandatory, and for many young men, it was a rite of passage, a chance to prove masculinity. For Chikatilo, however, the army was another arena of shame. Surrounded by stronger, more confident men, he quickly felt out of place. Military life was harsh and demanding, and once again, his weaknesses were exposed. His fellow soldiers mocked him for his thin frame, his timid nature, and his lack of experience with women. For Andrei, The army did not forge strength, it deepened his feelings of inferiority. During his service, he made attempts to interact with women. In one instance, he reportedly tried to pursue relationships with local girls near his base, but each attempt ended in disaster. His impotence made him the subject of ridicule, and the humiliation was unbearable. Soldiers gossiped, women laughed, and Chikatilo withdrew even further. Each failed encounter reinforced the same message in his mind. He was not a man in the eyes of others. He began to despise women for exposing his inadequacy, despise men for mocking him, and despise himself for being powerless. These emotions became the foundation of the rage he would later unleash on his victims. Yet the army also gave him something unexpected: discipline and routine. Though he was never respected by his peers, he learned to follow orders, to mask his emotions, and to survive in an environment where weakness was punished. These lessons would serve him years later, when he needed to hide his crimes behind a mask of normality. After completing his service in 1960, he returned home to Ukraine, carrying with him the bitterness of rejection and the desire to start anew. Back in civilian life, Chikatilo sought stability. He began working in communications, putting his technical training to use. His job was modest but respectable, and he took pride in being a contributor to Soviet society. His colleagues described him as quiet and serious, though odd in mannerisms. Outwardly, he appeared harmless, just another Soviet worker trying to build a life in a country still recovering from war. But privately, his struggles with sexuality and self-worth continued to torment him. By this point, Andrei had developed a troubling pattern of behavior. He would watch young women and children from a distance, observing them with a mixture of fascination and resentment. His impotence meant that normal sexual relationships remained impossible, and so he began to link arousal with voyeurism and violence. Fantasies of domination gave him a twisted sense of relief. In some instances, he acted on these impulses in minor but disturbing ways. Reports suggest that he groped young girls or touched himself in public, though these incidents went unpunished or unnoticed. In the rigid Soviet system, such behavior was often brushed aside, seen as shameful but not criminal. For Chikatilo, it was experimentation, a testing ground for impulses that would later explode in deadly ways. At home, his relationship with his family remained strained. His mother, hardened by years of famine and war, was strict and unyielding. She had no patience for weakness and scolded him relentlessly. Andrei's father, still marked by the stigma of having been a prisoner of war, offered little comfort. The household was cold, practical, and devoid of affection. Andrei longed for approval, but his parents' expectations and constant criticism left him feeling like a disappointment. To the outside world, he was a quiet young man, dutiful and obedient. Inside, he was a storm of resentment, shame, and unfulfilled desire. As the 1950s drew to a close, Chikatilo was in his early 20s. He had a job, he had survived the army, and he was considered by neighbors to be a decent, if peculiar, young man. But his private reality was far darker. He remained plagued by impotence, consumed by fantasies of control, and increasingly isolated. While his peers moved on with marriages, families, and normal lives, Andrei stood apart, unable to bridge the gap between his desires and his failures. His frustration grew, and with it, his detachment from ordinary human intimacy. The stage was being set for a double life, one where he would outwardly appear respectable, but inwardly nurture violent urges. The young man who returned from the army in 1960 was not yet the killer he would become, but the foundations were firmly laid. His humiliation had hardened into bitterness, his impotence into obsession, and his loneliness into resentment. Andrei Chikatilo was no longer just a shy boy from a famine-stricken village. He was a man on the brink of discovering that his darkest impulses might offer him the control he had been denied his entire life. The next chapter of his journey would see him marry, start a family, and build a career as a teacher, while secretly feeding the shadows within. When Andrei Chikatilo returned from the army in 1960, he appeared to be just another young man trying to build a future in a recovering Soviet Union. He had a modest career path ahead of him in communications, was intelligent, hardworking, and eager to prove himself. On the surface, his life seemed to be heading toward respectability. But beneath that outward normality, the frustrations of his youth, the impotence, the humiliation, the isolation, continued to eat away at him. He wanted desperately to belong, to be seen as a man, a husband, and a father. Yet the very thing that defined manhood in his society, sexual potency, remained out of his reach. For years, Chikatilo struggled with rejection. He avoided women, terrified that his impotence would be exposed again. But pressure from his family, particularly his domineering mother, weighed heavily on him. In Soviet culture, marriage was a duty, a sign of maturity and respectability. His mother often scolded him for failing to settle down, reminding him that he would become an outcast if he did not marry. In 1963, through introductions arranged by his sister, Andrei met a woman named Feodosia, who would become his wife. Their marriage was not born out of passion, but necessity. For Andrei, it was a chance to finally present himself as a respectable man, to prove that he could meet the expectations placed upon him. Life with Feodosia was complicated from the start. Their marriage lacked intimacy, and Chikatilo's impotence remained a painful reality. But they found a way around it. Through medical advice and unconventional methods, the couple managed to conceive 2 children, a daughter, Lyudmila, and later a son, Yuri. For outsiders, their family appeared normal: a quiet, hard-working father, a loyal wife, and 2 children living in a modest Soviet apartment. To neighbors, Chikatilo was polite and reserved, if a bit strange. He spent long hours reading, rarely socialized, and avoided drinking, which set him apart from most men of his generation. Feodosia tolerated his peculiarities, though she often described him as distant and cold. Their marriage functioned more as a partnership than a bond of love. During these years, Chikatilo pursued a career in education. He studied to become a teacher and eventually found work at various schools. Teaching gave him a sense of status he had long craved. In the rigid structure of Soviet society, teachers were respected figures, entrusted with shaping the next generation. To his colleagues, he was serious, disciplined, and intellectual. But to his students, he was something else entirely. Behind the closed doors of the classroom, Chikatilo revealed a darker side. He was awkward, authoritarian, and prone to fits of anger. He bullied weaker students, humiliated them, and in some cases, physically assaulted them. More disturbingly, he began to prey on children in subtle but sinister ways. He would touch young girls inappropriately or brush against them under the guise of discipline. Sometimes, he found himself aroused when physically punishing students. These incidents were rarely reported or taken seriously, dismissed as eccentricities of a strict teacher. But for Chikatilo, they were stepping stones, small experiments in crossing boundaries, feeding his twisted desires. Despite these disturbing behaviors, his career progressed. The Soviet educational system, plagued with bureaucracy and shortage of staff, turned a blind eye to complaints. When allegations did arise, he was quietly transferred to another school rather than investigated. This pattern of avoidance and negligence allowed him to continue teaching, and secretly, to continue exploring his violent urges without consequences. Each time he got away with misconduct, his confidence grew. He learned that as long as he maintained a facade of respectability, he could act out in the shadows with little fear of exposure. At home, his family life remained distant. He provided for his children, but was emotionally detached. He rarely showed affection and spent much of his free time alone. His wife grew accustomed to his coldness, focusing instead on raising the children. To outsiders, their marriage appeared stable, but in truth, it was a hollow arrangement. Andrei's secret life was already pulling him away from his family. His frustrations, his desires, and his need for control were consuming him more each year. By the late 1970s, his double life was firmly established. On the surface, he was a teacher, a father, a husband, a man who had achieved what his childhood self once thought impossible. But inside, he was a predator in waiting. His impotence had not disappeared. Instead, it had warped his desires into something darker. Violence and domination had become entwined with his concept of sexuality. He no longer sought intimacy. He sought control, fear, and submission. Teaching provided him with access to children, and though his abuses at school never escalated into murder during those years, they planted the foundation for what was to come. Each inappropriate touch, each instance of arousal during punishment, reinforced the link between violence and gratification in his mind. The 1970s were also a time of broader social strain in the Soviet Union. Economic stagnation, shortages of basic goods, and growing discontent with the government created a society where people were wary, distracted, and often unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths. A man like Chikatilo could thrive in such an environment. His odd behavior was overlooked, his predatory tendencies ignored, and his reputation as a quiet intellectual shielded him from suspicion. He blended into the gray backdrop of Soviet life, invisible to those around him, even as the darkness inside him grew stronger. By 1978, Andrei Chikatilo was in his early 40s. He had a wife, children, a career, and the outward image of stability. Yet none of it satisfied him. His marriage was loveless, his teaching career left him frustrated, and his inner urges had grown unbearable. For years, he had fantasized about taking full control, about releasing his rage and his desires without restraint. That year, he would finally cross the line from fantasy to reality. The carefully maintained facade of the teacher and family man would shatter, revealing the monster that had been growing inside him all along. The double life that had defined him for nearly 2 decades was about to take a deadly turn. By the late 1970s, Andrei Chikatilo was a man torn between 2 lives. Outwardly, he was a middle-aged schoolteacher, a husband, and a father. But inside, his frustrations and violent fantasies had been simmering for years, building to a breaking point. Decades of impotence, humiliation, and suppressed rage had warped his desires into something grotesque. For years, he had skirted the edges of criminal behavior, abusing children in classrooms, touching young girls, and finding arousal in acts of domination. Each time he escaped consequences, his confidence grew. Now, at the age of 42, he was ready to step across the line from secret perversion to blood-soaked reality. The year was 1978, and the setting was the small industrial town of Shakhty in the Rostov region of the Soviet Union. This was where Chikatilo would commit his first known murder. His victim was a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakotnova. Lena was a cheerful child, full of energy and innocence, walking home after visiting a friend when she crossed paths with a man who appeared kind and unthreatening. Chikatilo lured her with the promise of a toy, coaxing her into an abandoned house near a river. It was a setting he had chosen carefully. Isolated, quiet, a place where screams would go unheard. Inside that abandoned structure, decades of repression and fantasy exploded into action. Chikatilo attempted to engage in sexual activity, but as always, his impotence betrayed him. In a frenzy of frustration, he resorted to violence. He stabbed Lena repeatedly, his knife replacing the potency he lacked. As her young life slipped away, he discovered something horrifying about himself: the act of killing, the sight of blood, and the total control over a helpless victim brought him a sense of satisfaction he had never experienced before. Murder gave him what intimacy never could. The connection between violence and gratification was complete. When Lena's body was discovered, mutilated and discarded near the river, the local police were faced with a crime that shocked the community. Yet in the Soviet Union of the late 1970s, acknowledging the existence of such crimes was politically dangerous. The state did not want to admit that Soviet society could produce monsters like serial killers, a phenomenon they often labeled as a decadent Western problem. Under pressure to solve the case quickly, investigators rushed to judgment. They arrested a local man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a minor criminal record and a reputation as a troublemaker. Despite little evidence, Kravchenko was convicted of Lena's murder. In 1984, he was executed for a crime he did not commit. For Andrei Chikatilo, this miscarriage of justice was a revelation. He had crossed the ultimate boundary, taken a life, and walked away without suspicion. Another man had paid the price for his crime, and the Soviet justice system had proven blind. Chikatilo realized he could kill again, perhaps many times, and remain undetected. The sense of power this gave him was intoxicating. In the aftermath of Lena's murder, Chikatilo continued to live his double life. At home, he remained the distant husband and father. At work, he still played the role of the strict, odd teacher. But in his private world, he replayed the murder over and over in his mind, savoring the memory of control. His fantasies intensified. He no longer merely imagined domination. He craved it. The blood, the helplessness of the victim, and the release he felt afterward became his new obsession. Killing had awakened something inside him that could not be silenced. For several years after his first murder, Chikatilo did not strike again. Some criminologists believe he was cautious, fearful of being caught, and content to relive the crime in his imagination. Others argue that he may have committed additional murders that went unconnected to him, hidden in the chaos of Soviet policing. Whatever the truth, by 1981, his urges had grown too strong to resist. That year, he began killing again, and this time, he would not stop. The late 1970s and early 1980s were difficult years for the Soviet Union. Economic stagnation, shortages, and social unrest were spreading across the country. Communities were weary, distracted by daily struggles for food and work. In this environment, Chikatilo found opportunity. Vulnerable children and women, often from broken families or desperate circumstances, became easy targets. He lured them with promises of food, gifts, or companionship, always exploiting their trust before unleashing his violence. The brutality of his attacks escalated. Unlike his first murder, which had been impulsive and chaotic, his later crimes became methodical. He used knives, strangulation, and sometimes even his bare hands. Victims were mutilated, their bodies bearing marks of cannibalism and ritualistic violence. Each murder was not just an act of killing, but a performance of power, a way for Chikatilo to affirm his dominance and compensate for the impotence that haunted him. What made him particularly dangerous was his ability to conceal his crimes behind a mask of normality. He continued teaching for a time, though his career faltered due to complaints from parents and students. Eventually, He left teaching and took up clerical jobs, which gave him freedom to travel and hunt for victims near train stations, bus depots, and remote paths. To his wife and children, he remained quiet and detached, but not overtly suspicious. To his colleagues, he was odd but unremarkable. No one could imagine that behind his pale, bespectacled appearance lurked a man who had already killed and was preparing to kill again. The murder of Lena Zakatnova in 1978 was more than the loss of a single innocent child. It was the opening chapter of one of the most terrifying killing sprees in history. For Andrei Chikatilo, it was the moment he discovered his true identity, the moment when fantasy fused with reality. The Soviet authorities' failure to identify him not only emboldened him, but sealed the fate of dozens more victims. From this point forward, the Rostov region would become his hunting ground, and its people would live in the shadow of fear, unaware that the Butcher of Rostov was already among them, planning his next move. The murder of 9-year-old Lena Zakatnova in 1978 was the point of no return for Andrei Chikatilo. For years, his violent fantasies had been confined to his imagination. But now he had tasted the power of killing, and he would never be the same again. He had also learned something crucial. He could get away with it. Another man had been convicted and executed for Lena's murder, and Chikatilo had slipped back into obscurity. That knowledge emboldened him. After decades of humiliation, weakness, and frustration, he had discovered the one thing that made him feel powerful: the act of murder. For a time, he restrained himself. Between 1979 and 1981, he appeared to live a quiet, ordinary life. He continued working as a clerk in Rostov, still married, still the father of 2 children. But his fantasies were constant, gnawing at him like a hunger. By 1981, the urge became too strong to resist, and once again, he went hunting. This time, he would not stop. The years that followed would earn him his infamous nickname, the Butcher of Rostov. In September 1981, his second known victim was a 17-year-old boarding school student named Larisa Chichenko. Chikatilo lured her into the woods under the pretense of helping her find a bus stop. Once isolated, he attacked her. Unlike his first murder, this one was more deliberate, more controlled. He stabbed her repeatedly and mutilated her body. For Chikatilo, the frenzy of violence was intoxicating. He had found a way to channel his impotence into domination, using the knife as a substitute for the masculinity he lacked. When investigators discovered Larisa's body, they were horrified by the brutality. Yet once again, the Soviet police, under political pressure to avoid acknowledging serial crime, failed to connect the dots. From then on, Chikatilo's killings escalated. Between 1982 and 1984, he murdered at least 17 more victims, ranging from young children to teenagers to women. He preyed on the vulnerable, runaways, students waiting for buses, women traveling alone. Train stations, bus depots, and secluded forest paths became his hunting grounds. He was careful in his selection, often targeting those who would not be missed quickly or whose disappearances could be explained away as vagrancy or misadventure. The details of his crimes were horrifying. Victims were stabbed dozens of times, their bodies mutilated in grotesque ways. Chikatilo often gouged out their eyes, an act he later explained by saying he believed the victim's eyes contained an image of him that could identify him even after death. He mutilated sexual organs, sometimes biting off parts of flesh, sometimes engaging in acts of cannibalism. These acts were not only expressions of rage, but also the only way he could achieve sexual release. For Chikatilo, violence had become inseparable from desire. The brutality of these murders sent shockwaves through the Rostov region, though the public was not fully informed. In the Soviet Union, Acknowledging the existence of a serial killer was politically unthinkable. Authorities preferred to blame individual cases on random acts of violence or accuse vagrants, drunks, or other convenient suspects. Newspapers were forbidden from reporting widely on the killings, meaning that families lived in fear while officials denied the reality. Parents whispered warnings to their children about traveling alone, but there was no official acknowledgement that a predator was at large. Meanwhile, Chikatilo became more confident. He traveled frequently for work, using his job as an excuse to move between cities and search for victims. His appearance helped him avoid suspicion. With his glasses, neat clothes, and quiet demeanor, he looked more like a wary bureaucrat than a monster. Victims often trusted him enough to follow him, never realizing the danger until it was too late. His own family never suspected the truth. To them, he was distant and odd but harmless. His wife noticed his late nights and strange behaviors, but dismissed them as quirks. His children saw him as a cold father, but not a violent one. By 1983, the pattern of killings could no longer be ignored. Bodies were being discovered in alarming numbers, often mutilated in similar ways. The Rostov police began to suspect they were dealing with a single perpetrator, though they still refused to use the term serial killer. A task force was quietly formed, and investigators began looking for connections. But in a system plagued by corruption, secrecy, and political fear, progress was slow. Wrongful arrests continued, and innocent men were accused or even executed for crimes committed by Chikatilo. For the killer himself, the years 1982 to 1984 represented his transformation from a man experimenting with murder to a seasoned predator. Each killing brought him not only release, but a growing sense of mastery. He learned how to lure victims more effectively, how to conceal his tracks, and how to manipulate appearances. Yet he was not infallible. Some survivors narrowly escaped, describing a strange, bespectacled man who had tried to lure them away. These accounts provided investigators with their first rough profile, but in a nation where criminal profiling was dismissed as Western pseudoscience, such evidence carried little weight. By the end of 1984, the Rostov region was in quiet panic. Dozens of families had lost children, sisters, or mothers. Communities were terrified, though they had only fragments of the truth. The Butcher of Rostov had killed at least 19 victims by this point, and his appetite for blood showed no sign of slowing. For Chikatilo, each act of violence reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. He had discovered his purpose, his dark obsession, and he reveled in it. The awkward, humiliated boy from famine, stricken Ukraine had become a predator feared by all who unknowingly crossed his path. But as the killings piled up, the net began to tighten. Investigators were starting to recognize patterns, and whispers of a serial killer, though forbidden, spread among the police. Chikatilo had enjoyed years of anonymity, but his reign of terror was slowly drawing the attention of those determined to stop him. The Butcher of Rostov had fully emerged, but so too had the beginnings of the hunt that would eventually bring him down. By 1984, the Rostov region of the Soviet Union was gripped by fear. Bodies of children and young women were being discovered in forests, near train stations, and along rural paths. The corpses were mutilated, often stabbed dozens of times, their eyes gouged out, their sexual organs mutilated or removed. The brutality shocked even hardened investigators. Yet for years, the authorities hesitated to admit the truth. In the official language of the Soviet state, crimes of this magnitude simply did not exist. Serial killers, they insisted, were a symptom of Western decadence. In a socialist society, such depravity was impossible, and so the system itself stood in the way of justice. the police were under immense pressure. Each new body found meant more outrage, more whispers among the public, and more fear spreading quietly from town to town. Parents warned their children not to talk to strangers, but few knew the real danger. Newspapers printed almost nothing, bound by censorship. Only those living closest to the murders heard fragments of the truth. The rest of the Soviet Union remained largely in the dark. Inside the Rostov Police Department, however, investigators could no longer deny what they were facing. In September 1984, after several years of killings, a special task force was established under the leadership of Major Mikhail Fedosov, one of the most experienced officers in the region. Fedosov and his team were given the daunting task of stopping a predator who seemed to strike at random, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable violence. The first problem was the sheer scope of the investigation. Bodies had been discovered across multiple cities, towns, and rural areas. Victims varied in age and background: schoolchildren, teenage runaways, women seeking work. The randomness made it difficult to establish patterns. Worse, the Soviet Union lacked modern investigative tools. DNA analysis did not yet exist, and psychological profiling was considered unscientific, a product of capitalist criminology. Investigators relied on old methods, interviewing thousands of people, checking criminal records, and watching known offenders. This reliance on outdated techniques led to tragic mistakes. Dozens of innocent men were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases, tortured to confess to crimes they had not committed. Several mentally ill men were accused of being the killer. One man, already vulnerable and confused, signed a confession under pressure, only to later retract it. Another, wrongly accused, was executed. Each wrongful arrest distracted from the real culprit, allowing Andrei Chikatilo to continue killing with impunity. For Chikatilo, these missteps were confirmation of his power. He read about arrests in the newspapers, knowing full well the police had the wrong men. He even attended some of the funerals of his victims, blending in with grieving families, savoring the irony of being invisible in plain sight. Each time another man was accused, Chikatilo felt safer, bolder, more certain that he was beyond the reach of the law. But the task force was not entirely blind. Some investigators began to notice disturbing consistencies: the location of the killings, the mutilations, the choice of victims. Though Soviet criminology dismissed the concept of a serial killer, Fedosov and a younger investigator named Viktor Burakov recognized that one man was likely responsible. Burakov, in particular, became obsessed with the case, spending long days and sleepless nights chasing leads. He believed that only by studying the killer's psychology could they hope to catch him. It was an idea ahead of its time in the USSR. Meanwhile, Chikatilo's personal life was unraveling. In 1984, after years of complaints from students and parents about his inappropriate behavior, he was finally dismissed from teaching. But this did not stop his crimes. Instead, he took jobs as a supply clerk, which required frequent travel to different parts of the region. Ironically, this new work gave him greater freedom to stalk victims across a wider territory. Bus stops, train stations, and lonely roads became his hunting grounds. His victims were often those most vulnerable: young runaways, the homeless, or women desperate for money. In a society where disappearances were common and the marginalized were often ignored, his crimes went unnoticed for far too long. Between 1984 and 1989, Chikatilo murdered more than 20 additional victims. Each killing was more brutal than the last. His ritualistic mutilations deepened, his cannibalistic urges grew stronger, and his confidence soared. Sometimes, he killed in broad daylight, leading victims away from crowded stations into nearby woods without raising suspicion. The sheer audacity of his crimes highlighted both his cunning and the failures of the authorities. By the mid-1980s, the political climate of the Soviet Union was beginning to shift under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring. Censorship loosened slightly, and for the first time, investigators had a bit more freedom to acknowledge the reality of the situation. Fedosov and Burakov were able to secure more resources, expanding surveillance operations and gathering data on thousands of suspects. But even with this progress, the case dragged on. Each new killing was a blow to the investigators, a reminder that their adversary was always one step ahead. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the investigation was that Chikatilo himself was questioned and even detained during this period. In 1984, he was briefly arrested for suspicious behavior near a crime scene. Investigators noted his nervous demeanor and strange mannerisms, but when his background revealed that he was a family man and a former teacher with no serious criminal record, he was released. The oversight was devastating. The killer had slipped through their fingers, and within weeks, more bodies appeared. By 1989, the pressure on the authorities was immense. The body count had risen dramatically, with more than 30 victims attributed to the unknown killer. The Rostov region had become a place of whispered terror, parents clutching their children tightly, women refusing to travel alone. The Butcher of Rostov was now a specter haunting every bus stop and train station. For the police, the failures of the past weighed heavily, but they knew one thing: their prey was still out there, hunting. The years between 1984 and 1989 were marked by missteps, wrongful convictions, and tragic oversights. But they were also years in which the determination of investigators hardened. Despite the obstacles of censorship, bureaucracy, and limited tools, men like Fedosov and Burakov refused to give up. They had glimpsed the shape of the monster they were chasing, and though he still walked free, they were closer than ever to bringing him down. The Butcher of Rostov had thrived on secrecy and silence, but the silence was beginning to break. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Soviet Union was crumbling, its once iron grip on society weakening under economic hardship, political unrest, and the sweeping reforms of glasnost and perestroika. Amid this turbulence, one man exploited the chaos to continue his reign of terror. Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov, had murdered dozens with impunity. But now, after nearly a decade of investigative failures and false leads, the walls were closing in. In 1990, the task force led by Major Mikhail Fedosov and investigator Viktor Burakov had reached a breaking point. The body count had grown intolerable, and public whispers could no longer be contained by censorship. The people of Rostov and surrounding regions lived in fear, avoiding train stations, refusing to let their children walk alone. Investigators knew that if they failed again, the political consequences would be devastating. This was no longer just a manhunt. It was a battle for the credibility of Soviet law enforcement itself. By now, the task force had accepted what had once been unthinkable in Soviet criminology. They were dealing with a serial killer. Burakov, who had long pushed for psychological insights, convinced his superiors to consult Western-style profiling methods. The police turned to Dr. Alexander Bukanovsky, a psychiatrist in Rostov, who studied the killer's crimes with clinical detachment. Bukanovsky's profile was chillingly accurate. He described the perpetrator as a middle-aged man, socially awkward, likely impotent, harboring deep resentments, and capable of blending into society while harboring a monstrous double life. This description fit Chikatilo perfectly. Though at the time, the investigators still lacked the evidence to connect him directly. The net began to tighten when the killer grew careless. In late 1990, several murders occurred in rapid succession near Rostov, each bearing the same brutal hallmarks: mutilation, multiple stab wounds, and sexual sadism. The frequency of the killings suggested a man losing control, unable to suppress his urges. For investigators, this rash of murders created fresh crime scenes, fresh witnesses, and fresh opportunities to catch the predator in action. Police strategy shifted. Instead of chasing leads after bodies were found, they launched large-scale surveillance operations at train stations, bus depots, and rural paths, the killer's favored hunting grounds. Undercover officers disguised themselves as travelers, students, and workers. Every suspicious man was watched. Patrols combed the forests near Rostov, searching for evidence. It was a grueling, exhausting effort, but the investigators were determined. Andrei Chikatilo, meanwhile, continued his dual existence. To his family, he was still the strange but seemingly harmless father and husband. To his colleagues, he was the quiet, gray bureaucrat. But in the shadows, he prowled, his hunger insatiable. He targeted children and young women, luring them with promises of food, candy, or companionship. Once in the woods, he unleashed his fury. By 1990, he had murdered more than 50 victims, his crimes ranking among the most prolific in modern history. Yet he could sense the pressure mounting. Police presence at train stations grew noticeable. Whispers of a manhunt reached even his ears. Still, his compulsion was too great. He could not stop. The breakthrough came in November 1990. A body was discovered near a train station in Shakhty, a town close to Rostov. The victim bore the unmistakable signature of the Butcher of Rostov. Investigators flooded the area, interviewing witnesses, tracking movements, and scrutinizing everyone seen nearby. One name surfaced: Andrei Chikatilo. He had been seen loitering at the station, approaching young women and children. This was not the first time his name had crossed investigators' desks. He had been detained years earlier and released. But now the circumstantial evidence was piling up. Surveillance was ordered. For days, plainclothes officers shadowed Chikatilo as he moved about Rostov. They watched him wander train platforms, approach strangers, and linger in wooded areas. His behavior was suspicious enough that, on November 20, 1990, investigators made their move. Chikatilo was arrested outside the Rostov train station. The moment was anticlimactic for a man who had terrorized a region for more than a decade. There were no screams, no violence. Just a weary, bespectacled man led away by officers who hoped, but did not yet know, that they had finally captured their monster. At first, the case against him was fragile. Chikatilo denied everything. He appeared calm, even indignant, insisting he was innocent. The investigators had only circumstantial evidence: his presence near crime scenes, his suspicious behavior, his resemblance to the profile. Soviet law required hard proof, and they did not yet have it. For a brief period, there was fear he might walk free again, just as he had in 1984. But fate and careful police work intervened. When investigators searched his belongings, they found a briefcase containing ropes, knives, and lubricants, tools that matched the methods of the killer. Blood tests revealed that while his blood type was different from semen samples found on victims, a quirk of his rare physiological condition. Other forensic evidence suggested his involvement. Most importantly, psychiatrist Alexander Bukanovsky was brought in to interrogate him. Bukanovsky's presence was pivotal. Unlike harsh police interrogations that yielded nothing, the psychiatrist approached Chikatilo with clinical empathy, framing him not as a monster, but as a man with uncontrollable urges. Over hours of careful questioning, the killer began to talk. First in fragments, then in chilling detail. Chikatilo confessed. He described the murders one by one, recounting how he lured his victims, how he mutilated them, how he achieved release only through violence. He admitted to more than 50 murders, shocking even the hardened investigators. The Butcher of Rostov had finally unmasked himself. For the families of the victims, the confessions were both a relief and a torment. The man who had stolen their children, sisters, and mothers was in custody at last, but the details of his crimes were almost unbearable to hear. For the police, it was the culmination of years of failure, struggle, and perseverance. They had caught their quarry, but the story was not yet over. A trial would follow, one that would expose the darkest depths of human depravity to the Soviet public. The year 1990 marked the end of Chikatilo's killing spree and the beginning of his reckoning. The net had finally tightened around him, and though it had taken more than a decade of suffering, mistakes, and near misses, the Butcher of Rostov was no longer free to roam. For the first time in years, the people of Rostov could breathe, though the scars of his crimes would linger for generations. When Andrei Chikatilo was finally arrested in November 1990, the sense of relief among investigators was overwhelming. But their work was far from over. They had detained the man they believed to be the Butcher of Rostov. But in the Soviet legal system, belief was not enough. They needed irrefutable proof. The challenge was enormous. Chikatilo was cautious, intelligent in his own strange way, and skilled at masking his depravity behind the face of a wary bureaucrat. If he denied everything, the state risked another embarrassment, releasing him as they had in 1984, only for the murders to continue. For weeks, Chikatilo resisted. He sat in interrogation rooms, cool and detached, insisting on his innocence. Investigators presented circumstantial evidence: his presence at crime scenes, his suspicious behavior at train stations, the contents of his briefcase, knives, ropes, lubricants. But he denied it all. His rare physiological condition complicated matters further. The semen samples collected from victims pointed to a different blood type than his, a discrepancy that, at first glance, seemed to exonerate him. The case threatened to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. The turning point came when investigators brought in psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky. Unlike the police, who had interrogated Chikatilo with threats and accusations, Buchanovsky approached him with a calculated mix of empathy and clinical detachment. He did not call him a monster. Instead, he spoke of compulsions, urges, and the torment of being trapped by desires beyond control. Slowly, the defenses of the killer began to crack. In a series of chilling interviews, Chikatilo confessed. At first, his admissions were hesitant, almost reluctant, as if testing whether his words would be believed. But once the dam broke, the flood could not be stopped. He began recounting the murders one by one, detailing how he lured his victims, what he said to them, and how he killed them. He described mutilations, cannibalism, and the grotesque rituals that gave him sexual release. Investigators were horrified, but they also knew they were hearing the truth. Chikatilo revealed details only the killer could know: the number of stab wounds, the precise location of bodies, the sequence of events. He took police on walks through forests and fields, pointing out where he had left corpses years earlier. In total, he confessed to 53 murders, though investigators suspected the true number might be even higher. The confessions were both a triumph and a nightmare. On one hand, the Butcher of Rostov was unmasked, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. On the other, the sheer scale of his atrocities defied comprehension. How had one man killed so many over so many years in a society that prided itself on order and security? The Soviet system, already cracking under political upheaval, had been exposed as fallible, even negligent. By 1991, as the Soviet Union disintegrated, preparations began for one of the most sensational trials in modern Russian history. Forensic evidence, victim testimonies, and Chikatilo's own confessions formed the backbone of the case. The state intended to make an example of him, not only to deliver justice, but to show that even in a collapsing nation, order could still be restored. The trial opened in April 1992 in the Rostov Regional Court. It was a spectacle unlike any other. Behind the glass walls of a metal cage, Andrei Chikatilo sat, a gaunt, bespectacled man, looking nothing like the monster described in newspapers. Yet his erratic behavior quickly shattered any illusion of normalcy. He ranted, shouted, and even exposed himself in court, shocking the families of victims who sat in the gallery. At times he wept, claiming he was tormented by voices. At other times he mocked the proceedings, as if reveling in the chaos he created. The court heard testimony from grieving parents, siblings, and survivors. They described children who never came home, women who vanished on their way to work, teenagers lured to their deaths. Each story was a wound reopened, a reminder of lives cut short by senseless cruelty. For many families, facing Chikatilo in the courtroom was the closest they would come to closure, though nothing could erase the horror of what he had done. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Chikatilo's confessions were detailed and consistent with physical evidence. Items found in his possession matched the tools used in the murders. Witnesses placed him at train stations and bus stops near the times of abductions. Even without perfect forensic matches, the case against him was ironclad. The defense, however, attempted to argue insanity. They claimed Chikatilo was not fully responsible for his actions, that his mental illness rendered him incapable of understanding the gravity of his crimes. Certainly, his behavior in court lent some weight to this claim. He screamed, cursed, and babbled incoherently, at times appearing lost in a private world of delusions. Yet psychiatric evaluations concluded that while he suffered from personality disorders and sexual perversions, he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. He was legally sane. The trial dragged on for months, its every detail followed by a horrified public. For years, Soviet authorities had hidden the truth about the murders, dismissing fears and suppressing news. Now, in the post-Soviet era, the full horror was laid bare. Newspapers published transcripts of his confessions. Television broadcasts described the trial in detail. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had never heard the term serial killer before, were confronted with the reality that such evil could exist not only in their country, but in their very neighborhoods. In October 1992, the verdict was delivered. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders, though he had confessed to 53. He was also convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault and child abuse. The sentence was death. The judge, summing up the enormity of the crimes, declared that a man who had inflicted such suffering on society could never be allowed to live. As the verdict was read, families in the courtroom wept, some with relief, others with unending grief. Chikatilo himself reacted with defiance, shouting incoherently, banging on the walls of his cage. The spectacle was both grotesque and tragic, a fitting final act for a man who had thrived on chaos, cruelty, and control. The confession and trial of Andrei Chikatilo marked a turning point in Russia's confrontation with its darkest criminal impulses. For the first time, the reality of serial murder was openly acknowledged, studied, and discussed. The case forced changes in law enforcement, forensic science, and psychiatry. But for the families of the victims, such reforms were small comfort. Their children and loved ones were gone forever, their only solace being that the man who had destroyed so many lives would himself face justice. As the trial closed, the world knew his name, the Butcher of Rostov. He was no longer the anonymous bureaucrat haunting train stations, but a symbol of unchecked violence and systemic failure. His fate, however, was not yet sealed. Though condemned, his execution still lay ahead. For the moment, he sat in a prison cell, awaiting the final reckoning that would end his monstrous journey. After the verdict was delivered in October 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was no longer a shadowy figure haunting bus stops and forests. He was no longer the anonymous teacher, clerk, or wary commuter blending into the crowd. He was now Russia's most infamous serial killer, the Butcher of Rostov, condemned to die for 52 murders. For many, the sentence was a relief. Justice, at last, had spoken. But for Chikatilo, the years that followed were a strange limbo, a descent into madness behind prison walls as he awaited the end of his life. He was placed in solitary confinement in a Moscow prison, separated from other inmates. Authorities feared what might happen if he were housed among the general population. Prisoners despised child killers and rapists, and many would have sought vengeance. Instead, Chikatilo spent his final years alone in a cell, under constant guard, his only human contact being the guards and occasional visitors. At first, he remained combative and unpredictable. He ranted, shouted, and accused the authorities of framing him. He insisted that his confessions had been coerced, that he was a victim of a conspiracy. Yet, at other times, he slipped into moments of bizarre candor, discussing his crimes as though they were the inevitable product of his life's humiliations. But for those who know the story, the shadows still whisper of the man who once hunted there, a man whose name became synonymous with fear. Andrei Chikatilo is gone, but the legacy of his terror endures, etched into history as a warning of what humanity must never forget.